Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Doctor to Doctor in the Chat Room. I am here with a really great panel of people today, and we are going to continue our discussions around race relations in America. Before we jump into that, as I always say to you, I'm so happy to have you, and I want all of you to be safe and use those necessary precautions to stay safe. If you have not been tested for COVID-19, please do so. If you don't know how or where, just contact your local health department and they can steer you in the right direction. Wear your mask, please. I haven't said that on any of the shows. People, wear your mask, for your protection and for the protection of others. We know that changing systemic racism in America starts with every individual, every race, every culture. And I think it's time that we all examine our past and try and understand how we got here, where we are today, even if it means going to a place of discomfort sometimes. And conversations are going to be a huge part of what I consider the change process. And as I said on last week, hopefully we can move towards building sustainable equity for all people. And we want to start by having these conversations that will move us to a meaningful and lasting place of equity for all. And I am going to start with asking each of these people that I have with me to tell us a little bit about who they are, about their background. And let me say thank you again for being here today and your transparency and your willingness to have this conversation. I'm going to start with Dr. Johnson.
Hello, Rhonda. Nice to meet you guys. My name's Jim Johnson. I am a sports medicine physician and I'm a non-surgical sports medicine physician, which means my background prior to doing sports medicine is in family medicine. I'm from Bowling Green, Kentucky, live here in Nashville, Tennessee. I was fortunate to get to live all over the country while I was doing my training. So that, I think, gives me a different perspective too, and having lived in different places.
Mm-hmm. How about Stacey?
Hi, Rhonda. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. When KK asked me to do this, I was like, absolutely, for sure. Super excited. But I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a trauma specialist. I've practiced for well over 20 years now. Lived in Nashville. I've been here since 1996. I like to consider myself the first wave of transplants. Mm-hmm. But I'm originally from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and having been born and raised up north, and then moving to the south has been quite the experience for me. So that perspective, right, those two different perspectives have definitely added to how I see race and our culture. So I'm excited to talk about it. It's one of my passions, actually.
Thank you. How about you, Lyn?
Well, hi, my name is Lyn Hoyt. I am a community and parent organizer in Nashville, Tennessee, focusing around the public school system. And I actually grew up in Martin, Tennessee, north of Memphis. I am a University of Memphis grad, so lived in Memphis for a bit, so go Tigers. And have sort of through my outreach have sort of rolled into this role of race and reconciliation. And so it has become, I'm the white woman that talks about race. And so I'm excited to be here to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to have you here. And Kenyetta?
Hello, Dr. Shaw. This is my third time on the show. I'm glad to be here. My name is Kenyetta Wynn, and I am an administrator in early childhood education in Houston, Texas. And I have enjoyed also diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator at my school. And I have truly enjoyed the conversations, and I'm excited to join this panel this evening to talk more.
Yeah, thanks again to you all. I want to start with we've had a lot going on in the media. We've seen a lot of things going on over the last few months, but it seems to be something about this George Floyd incident that has really caused an uproar, and maybe even moved the needle a little bit, moved people towards having these discussions, crucial, open discussions about race. Why do you think that is? What is the difference? Because in my mind, I've seen other things in the media that I thought were very blatant, but it seems this one has people that would not normally speaking out. Either of you, just jump in and talk about that for me.
Rhonda, for me, it's one specific thing about the video that really makes me think that people noticed it more, and it's the smugness on the face of the officer. It's just that expression of lack of care that I think just sets any person off, because you can see that. You can see that it's just not a big deal to him. He doesn't think that he's doing anything wrong, and it just continues. Even when you first watch it, you don't hear what's going on in the background, but you still see his face. And you also see that Mr. Floyd is not really struggling. I mean, he's struggling to live, but he's not. I mean, from what I've read, was a really big man. And, they called him a gentle giant, but he seemed to still be gentle in that moment. He was just pleading for help, but not thrashing and making a lot of moves to try to escape. He was trying to comply, it seemed like. And the officer just had that look on his face like, I don't really care about you. This is what I'm doing now, and you're staying there, you come hell or high water.
Yeah, I agree, because sometimes I've even seen that picture that you're talking about, and it was almost as if it was a pose or something, hand in pocket, looking into the camera. So yeah, I agree.
I agree too, and I'll piggyback on that, because I think you have to frame that experience of seeing that with where we are in isolation with COVID-19. And I just think it's a perfect storm of having almost a captive audience. A lot of people's only outlet with the outside world in quarantine is through the internet. And so you had this huge audience of white people watching this horrible crime, frankly. And so I really think it was the perfect storm. The stars aligned. And then you frame that up with the Central Park Karen incident, and just all these things seem to just pile up on social media where it was in front of you. And I almost think you have to go all the way back to Charlottesville. But Charlottesville was where you saw, the typical, what we see, the typical racist, right, with the pitchfork, with the Confederate flag. And, those are the racists. But then all of a sudden you saw this, and you're like, oh, whoa, wait a minute. This is work that still has to be done. These are things that are happening now. And this is not just the guys with the Confederate flags. These are police officers. These are people that are walking in our parks. And I just think it's the perfect storm of reality check that we all needed.
Yeah. You were going to weigh in, Stacey?
Yes, I definitely agree. I see it as the perfect storm, but I also see it as there have been so many seeds planted along the way. And Lyn said, going back to Charlottesville, but I also think going back to Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, even Michael Brown, where the Black Lives Movement originated. I think that all of those things, that it's been brewing, and that it just tipped over, being that, we now have a captive audience. Also, some of those events weren't captured on video. Trayvon Martin was not captured on video. Mike Brown wasn't captured on video. We saw some things afterwards, but Eric Gardner seemed, or what's his name?
Ahmaud Arbery.
add Ahmaud Arbery in there as well. But George Floyd, I'm sorry,
Oh, yeah.
seemed to happen right before our very eyes,
Mhm.
almost in real time. But I do think that so many seeds have been planted along the way. And we can even go back to the civil rights movement, right, where there was work to be done. And we thought we were done with our work, but these occurrences continue to happen, and basically have slapped us in the face.
Yeah. I think that is just an awesome, I'm sorry, Dr. Wayne, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just thinking about what Stacey just said about how these occurrences continue to happen, and they're, we've had more since then. Again, and they're in isolation sometimes in smaller cities or things that we do not see, and that's, I just wanted to kind of talk to the panel about that, and what is it going to take, and why is it that right, because Atlanta happened right after that. There was the incident of the man being shot in Atlanta at the Wendy's. And so again, it's, what is it going to take for it to stop? And it was so in our face with George Floyd, but then it happened again, and then it happened again. So I'm just kind of trying to figure out, what is it going to take?
Well, and that's been happening, forever. Not forever, but at least 300 plus years. Certainly in the last 100 years. And then the response with the unrest, the civil disobedience, the riots or the protests, um, they're very similar to what happened in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and that went on for longer and longer back then. Some of those protests lasted for weeks, and we're seeing these protests kind of flare and fizzle in a way. So we've never really had a leader that has taken that on fully. And I'm not sure if we didn't get complacent during the 8 years of President Obama to think that everything was heading in the right direction, because the response from him was always so humane, right? So we thought, well, people are going to listen to him. He's so compassionate. He's not just a commander in chief, he's a counselor in chief. And that was all fine and good. But then as soon as that time is over, then we have a disorganized, chaotic leader who doesn't know how, even if he did care, doesn't know how to show that he cares. And we have chaos, in our leadership, and then we have chaos on the ground. And maybe the chaos is what we need to make a difference, but how do we sustain that? And the only way you sustain that is by changing policy. And that's going to be really hard to do until we have a grassroots movement of getting more people to vote and making big policy changes, or even little policy changes that are going to make the difference in the long run, because we're not going to make the difference with just, our voice. We've got to make our difference with our laws.
So some of what you guys have said, I think, is a great segue into, all the work that we know that has already been done, back to the civil rights movement. And Kenyetta was just saying, it keeps, yeah, we saw George Floyd, we saw that in real time, but then other things occurred after that. It just seems like we continuously address the whole issue of race. And what I'm wondering is not just what do we do to get it to change, but can we ever really get to a point where that's not even the issue anymore? Maybe we're dealing with something else, socioeconomic status. Maybe that's how people judge folks. I don't know. But, will we ever really get to the point, in your opinion, of course, where we are living in a world where that's really not the major thing anymore? It's kind of obsolete. It's not the thing. You look crazy when you judge somebody based on their skin color. Do you think?
I'll jump in. I pray for it. I think there's something baked in that is so systemic that it's going to take a lot of unraveling. And I really think that it starts with white people being able to identify it. And I think we still have a lot of work to be able to see it and identify it. Because you've got to come to a place to want to see it. And you've got to come to a place that can not only identify it, but then say, okay, then this is the change that we're going to make in our system to make sure that this is not a factor anymore, that these barriers don't exist anymore. But you know, I think it's a bigger question than I can even answer, other than I know that there's a lot of flawed systems out there that must be changed before we can see that reality.
I was watching CNN one night, and Chris Cuomo said he was speaking about a story of one of his African American friends had said to him, you know, why is it that America doesn't love me? You know, America just doesn't seem to embrace me. What is that about? And so I want to know what's your take on that. Why doesn't America embrace me as an African American person?
I think it still boils down to the de facto segregation that we have in not just the South, but in a lot of big cities, and the lack of proximity and actually getting to know people. I lived in Northern California for a while, and I don't think I thought about race when I lived in Northern California, because it was such an amalgam of many races: African American or Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, and you know, all mainly American born, not American born, some immigrants. But when you're around people all the time and they're working with you, and it's in a more kind of equitable percentage-wise distribution, more similar to society as a whole, you become to see people as people, and you don't see color anymore. But when you're in a place like Nashville that's still segregated, and it's segregated by neighborhood, it's segregated by area of town, it's segregated by type of job that people are expected to have, that you don't get exposed to other races like you should, or like you could. And I know that's maybe too simple, but I think that plays a big role. You know, I think all the time of how I think like, I try to think like an anti-racist, but do I do what I should do to be an anti-racist? I told Dr. Wynn, she was my friend, but why didn't I have her and Donald, her husband, over for dinner? You know, maybe that's because she was my child's teacher, and maybe that's inappropriate to be having your teachers over for dinner. But we really obviously had a fondness for each other, and we have a really common story of the way we were raised. And I mean, our parents actually do the same. My dad and her mom do the exact same job as educators and professors. And yet I never asked them to come over and hang out, or you know, they did invite us to church, and we went to church with them once, but that was a little bit part of my wife's school assignment. And why, even though I believe in employing African Americans at a high level of employment, why haven't I hired an African American to work in my office? Well, I think the main reason is I didn't have any African Americans or Blacks apply for the jobs. But should it have been my responsibility to go out and seek out those applicants and saying, I'm not going to close this job until I've interviewed a certain number of people from different races and different cultures. So that's the kind of thing that I, you know, how I want to make myself better. And that, I think, in a segregated de facto segregated society, that's what we're going to have to do to make a real long-term difference.
Stacey, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that, well, two things. One is that I think it's a point of contention to be colorblind, right? Or when white people, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but it feels like that's a bad thing, right? It's seen as a bad thing if you see me as Black and I see you as white. And I don't necessarily believe that it's a bad thing, because if you don't see who I am, being a Black woman is part of who I am. And my culture and my characteristics and my family ties are all tied up in and connected to being a Black woman. And so if you don't see me as that, then there's a whole bunch of me that you don't see. I don't know how many times when I was early in my career when I was told, well, you're different. And that, and in fact, was an insult because I spoke well, or that I had a degree, or I was polished, or for whatever reason, there was this need to be othered and placed in another category outside of other African Americans that that person or those people had encountered before. That was offensive to me. That was not a compliment. So it's okay. One thing I think that for us to communicate to others, to white people, is that it's okay to see color, because there's so much. I am so proud to be an African American woman, and I'm so proud of my family, and I'm so proud of my culture. And so it doesn't make me feel, it's not a negative to be seen as a Black woman. The question about why does America not like us, or why are we not accepted? I believe that is part of, because we are seen as, I think there's a cognitive dissonance that happens, right? As a Black person, I'm connected to America's original sin, right? This country is founded on the backs of my great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers. And, how do I make amends? How do I come to peace with that fact if I'm not treating you well, if I'm not treating you fair, if our society is not equal and just? I think that there's a disconnect that happens between what we believe and what we know about who Black people are. And we want to treat others kindly, but what white people are fed through the media and through history is that Black people are barbaric and animalistic and negatives, and to be seen as a threat. So I believe that's why white America has a problem with Black people, because we're seen as a threat, and yet they don't believe it necessarily to be true, and that rub causes conflict.
Stacey, I want to piggyback off of what you said, and you too, Jim, you both made very important points. Birth of a Nation is exactly that, Stacey. And I was surprised, if people haven't watched 13th, I hope they would take some time to watch that. But so many political campaigns were one using scare tactics and using Black people to scare voters. And so that is a very wonderful, not a wonderful point, but a true point that, why does America not love me? Because the constructs and the systems were put in place so that it would not love you, so that you were considered to be an aggressor. And to your point, Jim, businesses have to be more intentional. I love your transparency in saying, why have I not hired anyone? Well, it's not an excuse to just say, well, no one applied, when you see that you're missing something. And so thank you for bringing that point up, because that is the only way that we are going to get more brown and Black faces in top level positions, and to give people opportunities, is to look and say, I'm missing something, and I won't stop until it looks the way I know that it should look. And I've had that experience in education myself, and you would think, in teaching that doesn't happen, but it does. A lot of times people are just not intentional about the diversity. And the other thing is, once we understand that we are dealing with systemic issues. And once we recognize that, there is a true divide that exists, we will then say, not that we should lower our standards, but understand that in order to have diversity, in order to have differences in our workplace, we may have to have programs in place that help prepare people and help level that playing field when people are given those opportunities. So, again, I think you have to be intentional. And then I think you have to have strong mentorship programs when you bring people in who may not have had access to the, similar opportunities. So I feel like both of you made, very important points. Thank you.
And I just wanted to add to what Stacey mentioned about colorblind. I think language matters so much, and I think that white people have a lot of unlearning to do around that. And I appreciate you bringing that up and bringing that into the conversation. One of the things that I've learned recently is that the melting pot is actually not a good term to use anymore, and I didn't know that. But I heard that there is a new kind of a way to visualize how America brings all these different cultures and races and backgrounds together is more like a tossed salad, and that we aren't blending everybody in to be the same. We want to see our differences. We want to see all those different things that make us tossed salad wonderful and great. And so, and everything adds a little bit of flavor that makes it this beautiful meal that we all share together. And so that's sort of my new analogy when somebody brings some of these language pieces in and we try to unlearn what we have been taught as white people. So thank you.
Lynn, Jane Elliott, the educator, said that many, many, many years ago about the salad.
Maybe that's where it came from.
Versus
it's been passed along, thank goodness.
Yeah, and I know people don't necessarily mean bad by that, right? It's kind of like when I hear behind Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, right? And we know that they all do, right? But we know what our point is in making that Black Lives Matter, because we're the ones that have been mostly impacted by, police brutality and so many other things. And so I think, when I've heard people say, I don't see color, and I haven't necessarily heard it in a racist way. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, how can you not? I look at you and I know you're white. You should look at me and know that I'm Black. And as Stacey said, I'm very proud to be who I am, right? There's so much that comes with that. So great points. And we're going to talk about it more when we come back from break. We are going to go to break and we will be right back on 94.7 FM. And we are back, and we are still talking about race relations in America with Jim Johnson, Stacey Lanier, Lyn Hoyt, and Kenyetta Wynn. And I am your host, Rhonda Shaw, and we are still having this discussion surrounding race relations in America. And when we were off air, I talked to Kenyetta about moving us into another place in this discussion. Kenyetta?
Yes. So it seems that you cannot talk about racism without addressing privilege. I would love to hear what your thoughts are about privilege. One of the things that we often hear is white privilege as being a part of our systemic challenges that we face here in our country. So if you all will speak a little more on privilege for me, I would love to hear more about that.
Let me go first. I'll go first, Jim. I always like to tell a story because I like to bring white people into understanding what white privilege really is, because a lot of times they frame it around, well, I'm not privileged. I didn't grow up rich. I didn't grow up with these things. And it really has nothing to do with wealth or what you have, or even, if you were bullied or, had problems in your life. It has to do with the fact that those things didn't come because of the color of your skin. And so to kind of separate that out, I have this kind of funny story that I was at this conference once, and it was a race relations conference, and we were in the hotel bar, and I had had a glass of wine, and people wanted to leave. Everybody said, let's leave the hotel, let's go somewhere and do something. And so, and I was actually the only white person in this group. And so I flagged the bartender and asked for a cup of water in a disposable cup that I could walk out with. And I took the water, he gave it to me, and I took the water and I chugged the water and I poured my wine into the disposable cup and proceeded to walk out of the bar. And all these Black women that were with me flipped out, and they were like, oh my gosh, that's such white privilege. I would have never have thought to do that. I would have never gotten away with that. And actually they really called me out and said, you know, this really makes me uncomfortable that you've walked out of this bar with a glass of wine in a paper cup. And so then I proceeded to chug the wine because, you know, I didn't want to make everybody uncomfortable. But it was truly me stepping out of the bounds of recognizing that because of the color of my skin, I knew I wasn't going to get called out for that, where their experience was very different. So that's my little white privilege story.
Jim, you were going to weigh in.
I think my take on white privilege kind of, I have almost a formulaic approach to it, and I know it's probably because of my analytical mind, but I think you know, success or privilege or whatever you want to call it is a combination of talent or ability, hard work or effort, and opportunity. So I think that the advantage that I have as a white person over a Black person in terms of privilege is the opportunity part of that equation. Because if we have equal talent or ability, equal hard work, equal work ethic, I'm always going to have an advantage in terms of opportunity, or at least I probably have had my whole life. And I tell a story, and KK knows this story, but my dad became a professor doctor, just like you, Dr. Wynn, and you, as an EDD out of Peabody at Vanderbilt. But his dad was a sharecropper with a fourth grade education. So they lived on a farm next to African-American families. And for some reason, you know, that my dad's family was able to, all 10 kids graduate high school, 7 of the 10 have a college degree, and 3 of them become professors. And it was all due to opportunity that they had, probably because of the color of their skin, in terms of it was easier for them to join the military. It was easier for them to play on the sports teams, to develop more confidence. Even when my dad was in high school in the late 40s, you know, the sports teams and the schools were segregated. So he had opportunity to be successful. And so he joined the military knowing that getting an education was the way out of sharecropping. Mm-hmm. And so that was I believe the opportunity was because of the color of the skin, but the kid that lived next door maybe that was his friend when they were 5 or 6, had the same ability, same work ethic, but then didn't have the opportunity to go to the better school, didn't have the opportunity to necessarily join the military right out of high school, didn't have the opportunity, or maybe did or didn't have the opportunity to move to Chicago to work for a couple of years to make some money to be able to go to school. Mm-hmm. So that's my my take on privilege. Is I think it's something that, well, everybody can create their own privilege, I think, in a way, no matter the color of the skin. But I believe as a Black person, you're limited. You may be limited by the opportunity unless you really go out and grab it. It's not just going to jump out at you. It's not going to be easy. And for me, it was always easy.
Yeah. So I have experienced that, you know, in my career, where I've known I may have even been better qualified, but, you know, I lost out to someone that wasn't a person of color. And I tell you, one of the things that I tell my children when I'm having one of those heart-to-heart talks with them is I always tell them how hard I've had to work, you know, not as hard as my mom and dad and not as hard as their parents, but I've worked so much harder than people across ethnic lines when it comes to a job or whatever. I feel like I've always been in a situation where I'm always proving myself. I'm always proving myself. I'm always proving myself. I'm always proving I deserve what I'm, what I have, and even if it wasn't what I should have gotten, wherever I am, I feel like I'm having to just prove myself. And it's a horrible feeling, I just, it's just really a horrible feeling when you know that you are equally, you're not inept and you are equally qualified, but you feel like you're always in situations where you got to prove that, I should be here. Yeah. I see the head nods. I don't see anybody coming off mute. Are we moving on?
Well, I was going to come off mute because Stacey and I have sons who are best friends, and so we have a lot of conversations. And one of the things that a lot of African American families say to their children is, you have to be 3 times better than your white counterparts. And Stacey always says to me, I'm not buying into that. I'm not telling that to my children because of what Jim just said. That opportunity is systemic in the sense of the privilege that, the privilege that exists gives white people oftentimes better opportunities the way that our system is designed right now. So to tell your children that you have to work 3 times as hard can be a fallacy, because truly they can work as hard, and because they're brown or Black children, they still won't have that opportunity. So I'm thankful for her insight on that, and how she, talked to me about being careful not to micromanage your children or to scare them into thinking that they're not being their best because they have to be 3 times as good. And so,
yeah.
Jim, I just appreciate your honesty about that, because we do recognize that, white Christian males have opportunities that they get because they're born white Christian males. And so, again, as we talk about ways that we're going to move the needle, those are things that we have to have conversations about, and being more intentional about recognizing that the systems as they are designed now tend to lean in one direction, and what can we do, to try to be more equitable.
Yes, Jim, I appreciate your honesty. When you said that last line, right, and recognizing that things have been easier for you, that was like, whoa, I've never heard anyone, a white person, admit that before. So thank you. And to your point, KK, I don't think that, I think it's an impossible task that we be 3 times or 10 times as better. And I think that that encourages our children, and even, if we hold on to that belief, that it leads us right into, this place of well-being that is shaken to our core. And that's something that we can spend our lifetimes trying to unlearn if we, take on that mantle. And so life is hard enough without having to prove ourselves, which we all have to do that in many ways, right? But if we have to unlearn that, our mental health suffers on top of, all of the other things that contribute to, this mental health that steers us away from a holistic way of being. And if I'd like to encourage my children to be the best people that they can be, right? So that they can that they know they can step into their greatness, however that looks, without having to compare themselves to other people or other races, because it's an impossible task. So thank you, KK, for bringing that up.
That is such a great point, and thank you. So how do we, it's great having these conversations with you guys, and particularly in thinking about Lyn and Jim being so willing to talk openly about race. But, when, how do we begin to have these conversations that aren't with people that aren't so open-minded and people that have just been indoctrinated into the whole concept of, inferior, superior thoughts and when it comes to race? How do you guys think we move in that direction?
I don't mind going ahead and going. I think it's exposure, and I don't know how we do that, but it's exposure to education about the real history, a parallel to the parallel history or the commingled history of Black Americans and white Americans. I think that's the biggest thing that helped me start to understand more, was that I was exposed to that history from a young age, and then it made me want to pursue learning about the history. And then I think beyond that, it's exposure to people of other races in your same field, and when you see that they're the same in terms of knowledge and ability, and uh, I'm fortunate to be a teacher at Meharry Medical College. It's a part of I have a private practice, but I volunteer as an assistant professor at Meharry to teach the residents and the fellows. And that's exposed me to not only African Americans, but actually Africans that have migrated for the study of medicine. And, you really learn that, an African American doctor and a white doctor or an African doctor who are Black, we're all doctors and all have the same knowledge base and all are doing the same exact thing. And when you're interacting with a colleague in that particular milieu, I hate to say that you stop seeing color, because you still see the color, but you see the person, you see the individual. And I think that's how people learn to get along with other races, is when you start seeing each individual person by exposure. And that's why I think there are parts of the country and there are cities and there are areas where we may be moving forward in terms of race relations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you guys may have more experience with that living other places too, but I feel like when I've lived in other places and I've been in the medical world where I've been exposed to people of all races, all nationalities, I've become more aware of how similar we all are, and that their background cultures just help us learn more about each other and make us enjoy learning things about other cultures and exploring different traditions and different foods. And I think that's all important for moving forward in race relations.
And I'll piggyback on that and say that, actually, I'm going to flip it a little bit. I think that white progressives and people that are more open-minded are where we need to focus, not necessarily those that are closed-minded, because I really think that the more open-minded folks are more willing to go there and understand where racist systems and racism still exists, even though you might think you aren't racist. I still perpetuate racism because we are steeped in a racist system in this country. And so you have to understand how to identify racism in systems in order to be able to get rid of it. And I think that we need to look at more open-minded people and pushing them in a direction of making change. And hopefully everyone else will come along, because I just really feel like there are people that are closed-minded. Maybe, peripherally they'll come along. But I really think that those that are open-minded still have a lot of work to do to make this whole world anti-racist.
So, Lyn, have there been situations where you, in retrospect, you feel like, man, I wish I had said something, or maybe I should have said something in that? Have you experienced that, either of you? I mean,
all the time. And I just think, oh my gosh, why was I so scared? What's the fear of not speaking up at that time? That it was more likely that my silence was what was damaging, not that I didn't feel that something was wrong or something was going down that was not right. it was that I said nothing. That to me is, again, kind of going back to looking at open-minded people and progressives. You know when something's wrong, say something. So how do you get to that point of being able to challenge when you see racism happen and bring people along that will want to speak out? But yes, I mean, I am just want to have a V8 when I think about all the times that I could have said something that I didn't. Sorry.
That's funny. So, I thought it was really interesting after the George Floyd incident that I saw several things on Facebook. One that really stood out was a young white man was getting off work. He saw that a young black guy had been pulled over by the cops. The cops had the guy, maybe him and another young man, sit down on the curb, and he stopped to monitor. Did you guys see that? He stopped to monitor what the cops were doing, and just to be a presence to ensure that it just didn't, get out of hand or whatever. And I just thought, as crazy as it is that had to happen, you know, he kind of really went over and above to ensure that these young men were, made it home alive.
I know that there are some social justice organizations that are encouraging that as allyship, right? And that if, as a white person, you see Black people pulled over, that you pull out your phone and you start recording in an effort to toward keeping everyone safe or to de-escalate a situation. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an interesting step, and that the concept of allyship, I'm not quite sure where I stand on it. I've not done a lot of research around it, but I love that concept, right? That we have to monitor each other to keep each other honest. It's unfortunate. Yeah. But I don't think that there's ever a shortage of opportunities to speak out about, social and racial injustices. Yesterday, I was in a board meeting, and I'm the only Black person on the board, and our agenda was full, and COVID was one of the major agenda items. And by the end of the meeting, no one had spoken about the racial injustices. And so I sat there the whole time thinking to myself, should I say something or should I not? And to your point, Lynn, I felt compelled to speak up, because had I not, I'm not sure I would have been able to sleep last night.
Do you mind sharing? Because that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. Do you mind sharing some of what you shared in your board meeting about COVID and the disparities and all that? Do you mind?
Well, I just said that we took care of a lot of the major board business, and that I would be remiss had I not spoken up about the elephant in the room. And that being the racial injustices and things in George Floyd and other things that have happened here recently since COVID. I said that if it was important for us to be diverse and inclusive as an organization, then we as a board needed to be intentional about conversations around what's happening in our society, white supremacy, white privilege, implicit bias. And if not, I said that I did mention that I was disappointed that we had not had a conversation around it up to that point, and was hopeful that we could start to have those conversations. I said what I was not asking for was a statement, but more of the intent to continue the conversation toward saying something, doing something, taking action toward the racial injustices. And my heart was beating, but we have to take a stand. We're at a point where we cannot continue to be silent, because we know silence is complicity. So
yes, I agree. So last week, two of my guests on the show, well, one of the two of my guests said that, voting is not going to be where we really make the change in systemic racism. I want to know from you guys where you think the change begins with systemic racism, and you can answer that when we come back from break. We will be right back on 94.7 FM. And we are back on 94.7 FM, and we are still talking about race relations in America. As we were leaving, I asked, how do you think we can really begin this change in systemic racism? And I mentioned one of my guests last week talking about, it doesn't start with voting, and it's really odd because the polar opposite of that was said by my father, who was on my show about a month ago. And I shared with Kenyetta about my dad and an experience that he had growing up where his, his father came home one day and said, "Hey, we've got to move," because my grandfather registered to vote, and they were made to move off the land of the sharecropping person because my grandfather registered to vote, right? And as a result, voting is a big deal for my father. And when he was on the show, he talked about and we've got to learn how important the local elections are too. If we're really going to make some changes happen with police brutality and all of that, the DA, whoever your DA is, you got to make sure you vote the right people in, the prosecutors and the your legislators, your lawmakers, and all of that. So it's interesting that my father, a Black man, says voting is so important. And then, I have a white man on the show, and he says, you all always think about voting, and voting is not going to be the start of change. What do you say the start of change is?
I think it's activating. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think I mentioned earlier that I thought it was policy change, which I think is in part voting, but it's also in part who you vote in and if they're willing to make those changes. So it might be recruiting the right person to vote for. So that might be where organizations like Black Lives Matter, the party, could make sure that they're setting up policies that can be passed in these local places. I mean, that a lot of these bills that cause systemic racism in terms of the policies they create are written by these big organizations, and they try to pass the same bill in every state in the country. And as soon as they get a Republican legislature, they pass a bill that's discriminatory. And I mean, it's just like you see here. You can't even get rid of a statue that is symbolic of the KKK, whether you read the stories about what, if he really was a redeemed person or not, it's still symbolic. And it's like the flag in Mississippi. You have to get those things changed by a vote of someone, and that whether that's a vote in the legislature by the people that you elect, or that's a leader who does an executive order within his or her purview, like Obama did for 8 years. But then as soon as a person comes in that has a different mission, they get rid of all those executive orders and change them out again. So it's going to be it's a slog. It's just going to be a slog, and we're going to have to keep voting, but we're going to have to find a lot of other ways to make policy change too within the framework of the institutions, which have to be changed. But unfortunately, you can't change society until you change the institutions.
I agree with you, Jim, and I think that way of thinking is a distraction. If voting were not as impactful as we know it is, people would not have lost their lives over it. People would not have lost their businesses and their land and their jobs. We know that we have to change policies. And in order to do that, we have to have the right people in place to make decisions. And I think it is imperative that the Black community always is voting and make sure that they always have a voice in spite of. So I would have to agree with Jim that voting is very important.
I think it's multifaceted.
Yeah.
I think you got to go ahead, Stacey, if you want to go.
No, you go ahead.
I'll be quick, but it's that kind of saying what Jim said, but I think it's voting, but I think it's multifaceted. The other thing I was reflecting on, and KK, you and I now have children that are of voting age, which is very exciting to see your child vote for the first time. And two, yeah, you have two. I still just have one. And I that has just been an education to walk them through that process and to help them understand why it's important to vote in local elections. And it's also led to a lot of really tough conversations of, well, I don't feel my vote matters. I don't feel my vote counts. And that's what I hear a lot especially in my community organizing work is why should I vote when it's not going to change what's going on? And so it's multifaceted. It maybe it's protests. It's, putting pressure on lawmakers. It's finding the people that are connected to be able to align with you and what you think. If you think you don't have a voice, get your voice to someone that does have a voice. I think that's where white privilege comes into play. Use your privilege for good, because you can't get rid of it. So, right. And so I think it's got to be layers. It has to be multifaceted. And it has to be on the ground for people to understand this is how you make a difference and how you make an impact, collective voice, but it's also voting and trying to get lawmakers in that can actually make that systemic change that we so need in our systems. Thanks.
I see you, Stacey.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. I think it's multi-pronged and multifaceted, and we cannot underscore the importance of voting locally and nationally. Trump has installed and appointed over 200 judges, and so we know that we know what happens in legal systems and in court systems. So we cannot not vote. I have two children who are of voting age, and they are really excited to vote in the presidential election. I love what Generation Z is doing. They are making noise. They are disrupting things. I think we need to continue that and encouraging them to do that, but in a way that is sustainable, like you said earlier, Jim, so that things don't fizzle out like they have done in the past and historically. I also think that people like Colin Kaepernick, that we need people like him to disrupt systems and make us uncomfortable and make us face exactly what's happening and what has happened in our country. And I also think that we need to continue talking about the dreaded D word, dismantling and defunding police unions and police legal systems. So I think it is multifaceted, and it won't happen from one approach. Yeah.
So that's interesting. I shared this with Kenyetta that I literally got to speak to the Jane Elliott today. And she said to me, one of the things that we have to do is we have to keep this in the forefront, and we have to keep doing all of these things that you guys talked about. She said, because if we don't, and what you just said made me think of it, she said, we will go back to business as usual. Yeah. So go ahead.
I'd like to hear more about that conversation.
Yeah, believe me. So I want to read some statistics from a study done by the Pew Research Center on race in America in 2019. I want to read these statistics, and then I'll start with Lyn. I want you to just jump in and tell me what you think about this. 50% of Americans say that President Trump has made race relations worse. 15% say he's made progress towards improving race relations. 13% say he's tried but failed. 14% says that he's not addressed the issue. But most Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, believe that President Trump has made race relations worse, while about half of the whites say the same. Um, do you believe, what do you believe? And tell me why. What do you believe?
Oh, I think he's taking us backwards. I hope that 56% is larger. That was a 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully with 2020's experience, that number is higher. That's really what I would hope. That it's, it's what he's done around race relations has set us backwards. And so we've got to, I want to hear voices that unite us, not divide us. And I feel like he uses divisiveness and as a power tool, really.
So I hear
And
this a lot, Lynn. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead. I hear this a lot. I've heard a lot of people, white people, say that President Trump is not a racist. They will say, oh, now he does stupid things, but he's not a racist.
he's dismissive. That's racism. He tone polices. That's racism.
Mm-hmm.
He panders to racists. It's racism. He's not a uniter. He's a divider, and I think he plays into racist systems to do that.
Yeah. What do you think about this study, Stacey?
I think it's an interesting study. And I agree with Lynn that I think he panders to racists. He may not be racist, but he's not anti-racist. And I also believe that we needed him to do and to what he's done so that we can continue to expose the fabric of the United States, so that, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. But I do think that he is racist.
So it's interesting that you say that. Most people don't agree with me when I say, we may have to give Donald Trump some credit for moving this world to a better place, just because some of the things that he's done that he may not have meant for good,
Mm-hmm.
but they backfired. Now we're having conversations that we never thought we would have, right? Look at us here today. Look at what we're doing today. I don't think anything he's done was for us to be where we are having these particular conversations. So Jim, did you want to weigh in on the study?
So I feel like I have a little advantage here because I've just finished reading John Bolton's book, In the Room Where It Happened, and generally I think from reading his book, somebody that was in the White House for 18 months, that Donald Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing, and it's chaos. And I don't think Donald Trump knows what he thinks. I really like Stacey's comment that he may not be a racist, but he's certainly not an anti-racist. He obviously says a lot of things that are racist. Dog whistles constantly. All these words that we know are, and these sayings that we know are based in slavery and Jim Crow, and but I don't think he really realizes that that's what he's saying. I think the stats, kind of just go along party lines for the most part. And I think that there's going to be 30% of people that are going to like him no matter what, and are going to excuse whatever he does. But I think those are the people that really haven't taken any time to kind of study him and what he says, and they're just happy with the economy, or they're happy that they still have a job, or they think that when he says that he's going to help their family, get their manufacturing job back that they lost 10, 15 years ago, that he's not lying just to get their vote. because if you read this book, this John Bolton book, everything that Donald Trump does is for one thing, and that is to get elected or to win, because Donald Trump is just about winning, not with a W-Y-N, but with a W-I-N. So I wish everybody would read that book, because John Bolton is a super far-right conservative in terms of policy and politics. And then you'll understand a little bit more about how Donald Trump operates. But I think the stats are they're almost obvious. I bet it would be a little bit more this year. It'd probably be changed a little bit. And I agree with you, Rhonda, that if we didn't have Donald Trump, we would still probably be complacent like we got for 8 years, thinking that everything was heading the right way. And what is it that President Obama used to say is the arc of history moves towards, can't remember what it was, but generally
it's actually Martin Luther King. The arc of history moves towards justice.
Right. And President Obama used that saying a lot, because, he talked about justice over law and order, and, justice over order. And I think we're going to move towards justice after this past 4-year experience.
Yeah. My last question. What do you believe the level of sacrifice is going to be? Kenyetta said very early on in the show, even after George Floyd, we still saw the violence. We've heard about hangings in different places. And as we move towards something better, I do believe we're going in a better direction. Do you think there's going to be really great sacrifice?
I just think that's such a hard question in the bigger picture of humanity. Yes, I think there's going to need to be sacrifice. I think people are going to need to sacrifice power. I think people are going to need to sacrifice resources. And I say sacrifice, it's share. We need to share power and share resources. Is that going to get to a point where violence is needed? I think we're seeing that already. I think, sadly, that there is this backlash. I'm horrified of the backlash, of the violent backlash. But my question is, at what point do white people step up and also are ready to make a sacrifice? And that's whether that sacrifice is a physical sacrifice. I've seen white allies on the front lines of these protests standing in front, like did that at the White House, standing in front of Black protesters to protect them from police officers. It's going to take that. And I think it just is a fortitude that comes from you internally, and you act in that moment because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
It's hard.
I think a lot of people have already sacrificed and are continuing to sacrifice every day. And I think every Black mother feels like they are sacrificing every day. They have to worry about their Black son getting in a car after dark. That's just, I think that's a tragedy. The tragedy of this whole thing is that you have to think about that, and still, and we're not in the 1940s anymore, and you still have to think about that. So the sacrifices continue on the smallest level every day. And then there's, these lynchings, I think, is what I would call them. These police killings, I think, are lynchings. You can call a lynching a hanging, but I think every one of these killings is a lynching. Every time that there's a white supremacist implicated in a burning down of a church or a school, or even inciting a riot in the Nashville riots, a white supremacist caught lighting the courthouse on fire. Those are all lynchings, because the net effect of that is to to destroy the life of an African American young man, usually, because that person's going to get blamed most likely.
Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad that we are able to at least translate some of these energies from all of the recent events in the world into meaningful conversations, and hopefully again move towards some really meaningful change in the world. I thank you guys so much, and we've all already talked about our future together in future conversations. And I am so looking forward to that. And I want to thank the listening audience for being here again to share with us today. And we will see you at the same time next Saturday at 2 p.m. on 94.7 FM. We'll see you then.